Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of the Power series. Today, Positive Luxury's co-founder and CEO, Verde Nieto, will be in conversation with a special guest, Sir Jonathon Porritt, the veteran sustainability campaigner, author of award-winning tomes, and founder of Forum for the Future, a leading international NGO working with businesses and governments to accelerate the shift toward a sustainable future. He will be discussing his new book, Hope in Hell, and sharing his call to action on the climate crisis. Before we start, please note that you can submit your questions anytime in the Q&A box, and we will answer them at the end. Over to you, Diana.
Hi, Claudia. Thank you so much for your introduction. And hi, Jonathan. Thank you so much for your time today. It's a real pleasure to actually see you.
Yep.
And you have been busy, and your timing as always is impeccable. So a new book, Hope in Hell. I read it, I loved it. And if you haven't read or loved it, the people that are watching today, you can actually get it on Hive. It's an amazing read. Don't do it at night. Is my only advice.
Come on, it's not that bad.
So why Hope in Hell? Tell us more about the title, because as always it's controversial, but yeah, tell us more.
There are lots of people who think that there isn't any hope left when you think about climate change. I mean, the reality of climate change is hellish. It just is. It's either going to be bad, or really bad, or apocalyptically bad. But there's no way it's going to be good. So we are heading into some very hellish territory, and we can revisit that, not at length, I hope, because it gets too depressing, but we can explain a bit more about why that's the reality of climate science today. So you then have to confront that, and then you ask yourself the question, then is there still hope to avoid the really worst aspects of climate change? Can we stop, for instance, what the scientists call runaway climate change, when it's too late to bring it back into some kind of stability, some kind of place where we can still improve things? If it's running away with us, then it's almost certainly too late. So that's the question, and that's where the hope resides, that it is definitely not too late to avoid that runaway climate change. We still have time to do that. That's the hope.
Well, I'm glad that there is hope, because I'm going to read this, and I wanted to call you when I read this. It was quite late at night, so I'm glad I didn't. But now that I have you here, I will probably explore my curiosity. So I was falling asleep, and I was dozing off. I read consequences for the rest of the century. So where does it all take us? On a business as usual basis, it takes us up to 70 meters sea level rise from Antarctica, Greenland, and mountain glaciers combined over the course of the next few hundred years, depending on complex tipping points about which we currently have very little knowledge. At this point, I was not patient enough to actually read the next kind of 200 pages. So I was like, okay, so what can I do now? What should we do now? What businesses should do now? So yeah, those are my questions.
Well, you have to deconstruct that sentence carefully, because it starts on a business as usual basis. And what that means is we don't do anything serious about climate change. So we just carry on pretty much as we've been doing for the last 2 or 3 decades, which is talking a lot about climate change, doing a little bit on the margins, but not actually properly getting to grips with the real crisis. If we continue like that, then yes, we will eventually, and it could take, don't forget, it could take several hundred years for the whole of the Antarctic to melt down completely. But if all the Antarctic went, and if the Greenland ice sheet went, then we are looking at something like 70 meters of increased sea level. So that's the worst possible eventuality you can talk about, which is why I urge people to have nothing to do with business as usual. Get on and make sure that we have business as very unusual, which means that we respond properly to the climate emergency.
Absolutely. So, I mean, what does business as unusual looks like?
I think it means, I mean, we do a lot of work in Forum for the Future with a lot of companies, as you know. And the first thing we say to them is you have to be a lot more curious about the natural world and what is happening in that natural world. Because it's not just climate change. It's equally worrying when you look at what is happening to ecosystems today, to precious habitats, to a whole host of natural world phenomena that are just as problematic, especially when you start to consider ocean-going systems, reefs, the whole story about the natural world. You have to be more curious about this. If you're a business leader, don't think you can get away without paying proper attention to the natural world that provides the foundations for all of the wealth that you create. And it really doesn't matter what your business is, the natural world is still the foundation for all the wealth you create. So while you pat yourselves on the head for being brilliantly creative and capable of generating amazing profits and value for society or shareholders or whatever it might be, just have a think about how much of that wealth you actually owe to what you take from the natural world and our dependence on the natural world to provide for the stable foundations for all life on Earth. And it does upset me, Diana, I have to be honest, there are not enough business leaders in the world today who are curious about how the natural world works. That means they don't set aside time to think about it. They're too busy. They're too self-obsessed sometimes, let's be honest. They think they know the answers to pretty much everything, but they don't think the Earth has anything to do in terms of helping them come up with better answers than the ones they've got at the moment. So our first rule of thumb, first advice to any of the companies we work with is get curious. Find out about this stuff. Bring it into your scope. Don't delegate it to somebody else. Bring it into your scope. And that's quite a big ask because it means people have to read, be inquisitive, check up on databases, find out for themselves what's really happening. You will have noticed this, an awful lot of very busy business leaders don't think they read very much. They kind of bring it to me on a side of A4. That's all I can cope with because I'm so important and so busy, I haven't got time for anything more than one side of A4. Would you like to read this book? A book? Are you joking? So I'm being a bit mean, but we do know the stereotype. And disturbingly, the stereotype is quite often quite close to reality.
Yeah. And the thing is, you know, I think what COVID has given us all is time. Time to reflect, time to pause, time to look. And I think a lot of business leaders would probably found out by now that the evidence is out there, right? I mean, the natural world has breathed life into itself because we were not around. They were like, yes, all these humans are on holiday, brilliant, locked in somewhere, perfect for us. But the thing is with what we will do with this knowledge. So I think, what are your thoughts? Is it government? Is it leadership? Is new leadership? How can we actually turn this around?
I hope that one of the things that happens is a newly discovered sense of humility, because we have learned through COVID-19 just how precarious our civilizations are, just how vulnerable our economies are. We have learned that if we continue to abuse the natural world, including continuing deforestation and damage done to threatened habitats, that we will be affected. The coronavirus itself, as we know now, is what is called a zoonotic disease. It is transferred from a creature living in the wild via, we're not quite sure what yet, but it could be some other species or a domesticated species or a wild species, but transferred from that wild creature, often in a disrupted, destroyed environment that we've caused. And it becomes now the greatest shock to the global economy that we've seen for 100 years. Let's not forget we had the Spanish flu more than 100 years ago, which was equally disruptive at that time. So I hope we just think about this, that we just take a deep breath and understand that however brilliant the human species may be, we are actually very vulnerable and we are still completely dependent on the natural world. And having kind of internalized that story, then we can begin to celebrate the astonishing diversity, beauty, awesomeness of the natural world, as well as everything that it gives us, all the resources it gives us, these incredible ecosystems that provide us with services like pollination, for instance, all of these things. And once we get into this much more reflective approach to the natural world, more humble, more conscious of the gifts that the natural world brings us, more respectful and thankful for all of that, then we might start to make some more sensible decisions about what prosperity and progress on the planet looks like. It's a turning point for humankind of a philosophical kind. Sorry, this may not be where you wanted the conversation to go, Diana, but it has to be a philosophical wake-up moment, as well as a, oh my God, we're in terrible trouble now, what are we going to do about it moment. It has to dig deeper into the human psyche, both individually and collectively.
No, I mean, always that when we speak, I mean, we know each other for over, I don't know, a long time, 18 years or something. Wow. I was very young and very disrupted back then. And you've always been my mentor and keeping me in check with reality. So I'm very grateful for that. So when we speak about things like this, and I want to talk about a little bit more about your book, but you know, you said something yesterday which was quite profound. It's about we are in this binary moment in time, which is a little bit like what you just said. But I mean, I'd like you to kind of maybe share with everybody what you shared with me yesterday about this idea of this kind of not a crossroad I learned.
Well, to be honest, this is quite a new realization for me, obviously, because it's a post-COVID story that we need to address. We've had this shattering impact on people's lives, the deaths of many, many people all around the world, still not out the other end of it. We've got a long way to travel in terms of the coronavirus crisis, that's for sure. So we've had that shock, the health shock, and now we're just beginning to see the shape of the economic shock. And the reason why it's what I call a binary moment is that we've got a choice ahead of us now, because the reality is governments around the world are going to be pumping in trillions, not billions, but trillions of dollars of investment of one kind or another into their economies. The latest estimate is anywhere between 10 and 12 trillion dollars. That's an inconceivably large sum of money. Now, if those dollars, if that flow of investment goes into doing really smart things, which address the climate emergency, help heal the damage we've inflicted on the planet, build stable, cohesive communities at the local level, make our food production systems genuinely sustainable. If we do all of that, if those trillions of dollars flow into all of that stuff, well, honestly, it's a reasonable prospect that we have for 2030 and beyond. If the lion's share of those dollars, of those trillions of dollars, go into the old style economic development, progress through industrialization, progress through fossil fuel intensive businesses, progress through growth at any cost, keep trashing the natural planet because that's a price worth paying for more economic growth. If all those dollars flow in the same ways they've flowed for the last 40 or 50 years, then we will not come out the other end of this with anything other than an exceptionally grim prospect. So that is binary, as in we have a choice. And it goes one way, which is going to be, I think, quite exciting and good, or it goes the other way, in which case we're screwed. It's pretty amazing to stand at that moment in time. And we are all there at that inflection point right now, including everybody on this call, everybody thinking about their own responsibilities as a leader in this world. You are on that inflection point right now. So what is your role in terms of the direction?
Well, I mean, you have been working at this for over 45 years, which is a long time. And we will not be in this inflection point if it wasn't for the work of you and a few, not that many people like you that for a long, long time has been shouting and screaming the importance of climate change and why we are today where we are. So you know, as you know, we positive luxury, we work with luxury brands. You always challenge me on this and challenge our assessment to be, you know, in the forefront of this future. So, as you know, luxury leads the way that sometimes see change is aspirational, is the dream. And if you change the 1%, you change the world. We trade places for a second and you'll see of positive luxury. What do you tell all these CEOs of luxury brands that they should be doing today to actually choose the the good, the hope one, not the, you know, whatever happens, you know, not the other road.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yes, it's a good discussion we have about this, Diana, because luxury is from a sustainability point of view, luxury is a complicated idea to wrap your head around. And the reality is that in a genuinely just, fair and sustainable world is that there may still be things that we would count as aspirational goods and services, but we won't have a huge burgeoning luxury industry of the kind that we have now because, putting it bluntly, it is too wasteful. It is too wasteful. So the starting point for this is that luxury is a privilege, and people who have enough wealth to enjoy access to luxury goods and services are amongst the most privileged people on this planet. With privilege comes responsibility. And the more privileged you are, by virtue perhaps of your own good efforts, that you really have done things that have enabled you to arrive at that very powerful position where you can enjoy luxury goods and services, more often than not, you're there because you've inherited wealth. That is how most luxury is shared in the global economy today, is people who are born into already very wealthy families. If you are one of those people and your privilege comes from the wealth created before you, then your responsibility is even greater than it would be otherwise, because you have the knowledge and the resources and the opportunity to make a difference that many, many other people in the world today could not possibly make because they don't have the privilege of the wealth that comes for people who enjoy luxury. So for me, it's it's not a paradox exactly, but with great wealth and opportunity comes great responsibility. And I do sometimes feel angry is not the right word, I feel disappointed that people who have that level of wealth don't think that that disproportionately should influence the way in which they dispose of their wealth, use their wealth, help other people. All of these complicated questions about how to use wealth in a capitalist economy. So it's very difficult for you, Dan. It's much easier for me to say it because, of course, you are the CEO, and you are obviously really keen to persuade, cajole, encourage, push people along, and you can't really give them a lecture along the lines that I've just given them, which sounds a bit pious and, oh, for God's sake, Jonathan, get a life. That isn't how luxury works in the world today. Well, maybe it's easier for me to say it than it is for you, but I bring it right back to responsibility, personal responsibility and organizational corporate responsibility. If you're talking about a company that is in the business of providing luxury goods and services, the responsibility is that much greater.
So invest into straighten not just your supply chains, but great excellence leadership to lead the company to a 21st century.
Yeah, and also, I mean, if we're talking now about people who are in the luxury business, as it were, they've got customers who they're obviously really keen to keep loyal, loving their brands, loving their products, loving what it is they provide. And sometimes there's a temptation to treat those customers as if they were so special that we don't dare try and encourage them to think differently about their position in the world. But luxury brands can change the opinions of people who are buying those brands. And once that brand gets its head around what complete sustainability looks like in its supply chains, in its procurement, in the way in which it treats its workers, in its commitment to human rights, in its commitment to climate change and the environment and so on. Once it's done all of that, then sharing that with its customers and making sure they understand why they want to bring them their goods and services with all of that, that's such an amazing opportunity to reach out, as you said, to the 1%. Actually, I think it's closer to the 1% of the 1%, but anyway, you know what I mean.
Thank you. So going back to your book, you talk about that, you know, kind of, you write this book for young people. Why you are appealing to youth? Because you're not appealing to young people like, you know, the 30 and the 20s. You're also appealing to the 10 and the 9 and the 8 years old that actually boycotts the favorite spreads at the moment because they believe that they have palm oil and they know that palm oil killed their monkeys. So tell us more about that. Why young people?
Yeah, don't get me onto palm oil because...
No, I won't. I forget I actually mentioned it. I take that back.
Yeah,
delete
you know,
that.
I get a bit obsessed about the difference between good palm oil and bad palm oil, but that's
yeah. I forget I said it.
Young people, okay, young people. One of the things I'm lucky enough to have in my portfolio of activities, I'm Chancellor of Kiel University. And that means every year I see a lot of young people of that age, student age. And I have been working quite a lot with young people's organizations, young climate activists over the course of the last 2 years to encourage them, help them, support them in whatever way I can. And 2019 for me was just the most inspirational year. I mean, I just loved that explosion of new political energy on our streets through Extinction Rebellion, and then in our faces through young people simply saying that this is enough, you guys, older people, this is enough. You know perfectly well that the way you're living today is actually jeopardizing our opportunities to live in the future. You are literally stealing our future, which, by the way, is what we are doing. That is not just rhetoric. We are stealing their future in terms of the likelihood of them being able to live good, decent, secure lives in the future, because we will have done such damage to the planet. And talking to those people, it's impossible to turn away from their sense of more than disappointment, a real deep anger that the generation they would normally be looking up to as a role model, something they might aspire to themselves, now they're looking up to that older generation and saying, we don't get this. You're not actually acting as good role models for us. You're acting as precisely the opposite. You're acting as irresponsible vandals in the world today, stripping the world of its wealth and essentially making it impossible for us to think about what a good world is going to be for us. I have heard that anger at first hand, Diana, on many, many occasions. And I've heard fear. I've heard deep pain at the damage being done to the earth and to its creatures. Young people care passionately about the pain that we inflict on other animals, whether that's through domesticated animals or wild animals, whatever it might be. This is not something I've kind of read about. I've heard these voices and they resonate with me. They stay with me. So my sense of it now is justice is not just justice for people who haven't done very well out of the global economy so far, but justice between generations. And what I know is my generation and the next generation below me, as it were, boy, we are massively out of kilter when it comes to treating the next generation, younger people, with the justice they have every entitlement to expect from us. So that's what drives me on. And the book really was written in part for young people to persuade them that they don't have to take this stuff from older generations any longer. Indeed, they absolutely mustn't, because unfortunately we will go on acting in this way until such time as they stop us.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think people are listening, and well, the proof is in the streets. You know, we started, I mean, you said this the other day, was what, the first march, how many people were there? And the last one was millions across the world.
Yeah, well, I love that. I love that little moment in the history of social movements, because I've obviously, having been involved in green politics for a very long time, I've kind of absorbed a lot about what makes for effective social progressive movements, and the growth of that social movement. And I mark it symbolically with the image of Greta Thunberg sitting on her own outside the Swedish parliament, holding up that handmade placard of hers saying strike for the climate, and her refusing to go into school on Friday. And she was, as you know, for the first couple of Fridays, completely alone. And you take that exceptionally powerful, iconic photo of her sitting there, and then you think through the next 15 months, which is what it took to the end of 2019. And by the end of 2019, something like 7 million young people had been involved in climate protests of one kind or another around the world. 7 million, 1 to 7 million in 15 months. That is pretty amazing. So for me, I look at the multiplier there and I think that's a good start. Now we need to go from 7 million at the end of 2019 to 70 million, because I'm absolutely persuaded that politicians won't do what they need to do until that generation makes it impossible for them not to do it. So 70 million, 700 million. The little reminder to anybody listening to this call, who probably are going to be a bit older than most of those kids out in the streets, is that 2 billion people in the world today are less than 20 years old. 2 billion.
It's a lot.
And how do you think they're going to react to this when they get the same level of knowledge that the 7 million at the end of 2019 had got?
It's exciting. I think we live in an exciting times. I mean, when you talk about Greta, I think about you and a few others that I have the privilege to know, because you started this 45 years ago and it was like a few, like, I don't know, I can probably count them with the palms of my hands, the fingers in my hands. And when I started my career on this was 23 years ago. And again, not that many. But today, and this is 45 years through our history in which we have made kind of almost literally no progress. Let's face it. But
well,
a little progress. But in the last 18 months, it's been absolutely unbelievable, exponential, and that is what I feel. I feel really excited, really excited.
Yeah, and the reason why I would push back on almost no progress is a lot of what has been happening has been quite, not exactly under the radar, but it hasn't been as visible.
No, it's true.
To commentators, to the media, to politicians, as you imagine. But just to say it here, actually one of the most astonishing changes in the last 5-10 years maybe is the incredible number of people in the business community who absolutely get this now. They really do understand that the model of progress that depends on trashing the source of all wealth is actually mad. It is literally a pathological approach to creating wealth. And more business people, they may not put it in the words that I've just used, but more and more business people know that this model of progress is not sound. It is not sustainable over time. So we've got hundreds of progressive companies now in the vanguard of trying to do something about climate change. I lose count of the number of new initiatives involving business, whether it's Science-Based Targets Initiative, renewable electricity 100%, We Mean Business. Christiana Figueres has just launched a new initiative called the Climate Pledge, which is inviting companies to deliver on their Paris equivalent targets 10 years ahead of the target date by 2040, not by 2050. Honestly, I look to the business community now, and as you know, I never give the business community a clean bill of health, for sure, but I look to the business community now and I think, well, thank God that we've actually got some real leadership coming from that source, because we sure as hell haven't got it coming from the political class around the world. The real leadership in that respect is between civil society on the one hand and business on the other. And that change has been going on. So when you say made no progress, we mustn't forget how gentle some of these transformations can be.
Yep, I have to apologize for that. It's my South American kind of sense of urgency. So when I mean made no progress, it's like now.
Yeah.
So Okay, my last question to you before I turn it to the public, which is like, you are a visionary. I mean, you hardly have gotten it wrong. I mean, you always bang on the money. So what will the world look like in the next 5 years?
It is funny because although I'm really pleased to have this new book out and about, Hope in Hell, it has been the most painful book I've ever written. Painful as in really testing for me personally, really difficult, because I've had to confront the reality of what climate science is telling us. I've had to think about the implications of that. I haven't been able to write those words without playing them in my mind, and it's not easy. If you look at the pain already in the world today and you look at the pain that is coming, it's impossible not to be personally affected by that. But I only mention that because the book that I wrote before that, which was called The World We Made, was actually the most joyful book that I've ever written, because I was writing it from the perspective of someone in 2050, looking back at how it was that we came to be living in a pretty good world in 2050, much more just and fair, much more compassionate and gentle in the way that we treat each other and the world, with a more or less stable climate, not completely, but we've avoided this horror story of runaway climate change, so we're not going to have a 70-meter sea level rise, etc., etc. We live more intelligently, smartly, caringly, locally. A lot more of what makes life special goes on at the local level. We've just got smarter about things. We stop putting such huge weight and significance on stuff that is just ephemeral, meaningless, doesn't carry any weight, genuine weight at all. And I love writing that book because it was as if I'd given myself permission not to do some crazy utopia, as in utterly detached from reality, but just to think, if we really did that and we were serious about it, just imagine what that world would look like. And actually, there's no secret about this. I'm sure you've done some workshops like that with Positive Luxury, but if you get people in a workshop context and you sit them down and say, okay, why don't we just break the ice here by saying, what kind of world would you really like to live in? Just let's do this on a personal basis. Tell me, what's the world you want your children to live in, or your community to be living in? What do you want about healthcare services, about education, about opportunities to get access to good work, about fairness? Just put it all down, draw it maybe, or write it. Every single time you do that, Diana, pretty much every single person comes up with exactly the same model of what a good life looks like. We know what a good life looks like. We've just been diverted from making that people's reality by virtue of completely insane, suicidal, ideological idiots who've distracted us from the reality of what good living is all about.
Okay, so thank you. And let's see what questions we have for you. What do you think the role of global politics is in this conversation? Will our current political system entirely inhibit the change that is necessary?
Yeah, this is the absolute nub of it. And I'm so glad you've got that in that question, because there are some people who are so disaffected with politicians that they just say, we're going to have to do this without the politicians. We're going to have to use the genius and creativity of business and the energy and passion and integrity of civil society and professional classes and faith groups and all the rest. We're going to have to circumvent government and make all of these changes happen without it. This is not sensible. It is only governments that can regulate market-based economies so that we come up with sensible outcomes instead of suicidal outcomes. You have to have elected representatives of the citizens to pass laws which enable us to live harmoniously on this planet. It isn't going to happen by any other means. So however frustrating it is, and my God, it's frustrating, you can tell I don't think too highly of the political class today, we still have to make it work through those democratic systems. And that is a real tenet of my commitment to sustainability, is you have to do it through working, functioning, representative democracies, which is why obviously people like me are a bit worried that so many countries which are still notionally democracies are actually now governed by autocratic populists. And I'm not going to run down the list because that's even more depressing than the prospect of a 70-meter sea level rise. But those countries that have actually destroyed their own functioning, intelligent democracies, that is a big barrier to what we need to do on climate change, for sure. And I've got a whole chapter on that in the book, because you can't turn away from that. You can't just say, the politicians, they're hopeless, we'll have to do it without them. That's not real. So for me, that's a big question. I mean, I, as you know, I'm enthusiastic about the role of business, but I would never, ever, for a single second, say that business is a substitute for properly regulated governments setting the standards, setting the framework within which those businesses then deliver the outcomes we want as the people.
Thank you very much for that. There's somebody else that said, this has been such an inspirational webinar. Thank you. And thank you for the statement. What is one simple action that can suggest everyone takes to start making positive changes?
Yeah, well, I'm taking a punt here on the average age of people on this call, as you know, Diana, which may be very rude, because otherwise I might talk about the need to limit the number of children that you have to no more than 2, but I don't think I'll go there on this call. So I'm going to try and make a sort of instinctive guess here about what the people listening to this, what you're like. Sorry if I put it in those terms, but what you're like. And for me, the bit that often gets left out of advice as to what we should do is advice about how we use our money. Whether we've got lots of money or whether we've got a little bit of money, it doesn't actually matter what the scale of the money is that we're talking about here, because everybody now has a pension. Everybody now has to find ways of investing in that pension. So that's the minimum. And then obviously, as we know, we've got a lot of people with a lot of wealth where they've got investments in every conceivable asset class that you can imagine. So the starting point for any real owned sense of personal responsibility is, what is your money doing in the world today? Is it working hard to ensure a good outcome for our generation and for future generations? Is it invested in the kind of places which de-risk all the horror story of climate change and create opportunities of a fairer, more intelligent kind? Or do you actually, perhaps horrible thought, not know where your money is? Have you ever really done that analysis so that you know where every last pound that you can say, yep, that's my money, that every last pound where that is? Because that is the starting point. So your organization, Diana, is called Positive Luxury. There's a wonderful organization called Positive Money. There are lots of organizations that are out there saying, if you're lucky enough to have money, for God's sake, use that money to good effect, because that can be the starting point for really brilliant things happening in society. And I love the idea that we might all take that away as a kind of primary responsibility now. So it's not just what we buy or how we travel or blah-de-blah, all that kind of stuff, but what do we do about our own pensions, our own investments? How do we make that work? And by the way, in case you're worried, you won't be losing out, because the really brilliant data now shows that everybody who's invested in ethical and sustainable funds over the last 10 to 15 years has actually had a better return on their investments than people who put their money into bog standard planet trashing investments. Isn't that good?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, that's a great point, an action point. So ask your bank how you invest your money. This is another question, and probably the last one, actually. We might have time to squeeze another one, but if not, this is from a 17-year-old, I don't know if lady or not, because we don't have the name. She or he wants to know what to take part in the fight against climate change. Where shall I start? I really like strikes as a good start, but is that really enough?
Well, it's, with all of these things, it is a start, but it's a good start because it's a community. It's not just a It's not just an action. It's not just an opportunity to express who you are and what your concerns and your passions are and your worries about climate change. It's more than that. I call it an emergent community. And what I've learned over the last 2 years working with some young people's organizations is this sense of community, of solidarity between young people through a shared campaigning cause is really important. Because for me, Diana, one of the things I've learned in the last 2 years is this burden on young people today can be intolerable. I mean, you were making a joke, and I'm very happy about this, about not being able to go to sleep because you'd read a particular paragraph in my book, which seemed to be so apocalyptically awful that sleep was denied you. Okay, now imagine you're a 17-year-old and you're reading this stuff and you're not given any way out of that. You're not given a positive way of contributing to all the good things that are going on in the world. You're just given that dreadful message about how bad your future is going to be. We, older people, have to understand what that is doing to younger people today and the burden that it is laying upon them. And I'm sorry to have to say this is slightly depressing. There are a lot of young people today who are already feeling incredible emotional pain as a consequence of seeing what this means for their futures. And it's not an easy thing to acknowledge. One of the little initiatives I'm involved in is helping young people develop more resilience to cope with this thing. It's not of their making. They would much rather not be reading dreadful stuff about how the climate is changing. That's not what any young person would choose to be doing if they didn't have to. So I'm very conscious that the starting point is to think about how to work with your friends, your colleagues. I mentioned I'm involved in Kiel University. I love the way that the student body at Kiel is a very active way of getting young people involved. In schools, there are more and more young people's organizations being formed. There's a fantastic network of young climate activist organizations here in the UK, which you can very easily find. But for me, that community is a fundamental psychological, emotional and psychological resource. Don't try and do this on your own. It's hard. So use those friendship networks and online stuff as well. Brilliant facilities online to find ways of addressing these things. You're muted, Diana. Host mutes herself. It's a Zoom no.
Sometimes a good thing. I was going to say that there is definitely hope in hell, and we need to think positively that we can together. I think the key word is together. We can fight to really, I don't know, completely eliminate, but at least revert the impact that climate change is changing. So do you have a last thought to leave with us in terms of which action we can take?
Well, I do sort of, not in terms of any one action, but I'll tell you what, when I started out on this, as you pointed out a couple of times, Diana, quite a long path, I would make a lot of great, rhetorical statements about how all the solutions exist to allow us to do this differently. Actually, that was mostly not true, if I think about it now. We did not have the solutions available to us in the 1980s to deal with the climate emergency. But now I can say that, and I don't have to feel a single moment's hesitation about stating that, because the intervening years have brought these solutions into the midst of the economy as realistic, practical, investable solutions to the problems that we face, which is why I love the fact that we have now this portfolio of solutions, not just on the energy and transport side and manufacturing and all the rest of it, but this incredible portfolio of solutions. And there's a lot of capital in the world today to make that possible. So for me, I feel much more comfortable now with my rhetoric actually being close to reality. Whereas if I reflect on what it must have sounded like back in the 1980s, people probably thought, oh yeah, really? You think we got the solutions to this? We didn't have. Today, we do have, and that is amazing.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan, and thank you for your time and for your insights. A real pleasure as always. And I would like to hand on to Claudia, please.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for your time today. I just want to remind to our audience that Hope in Hell is available on Hive Bookshop, so get your copy as soon as possible. Next week on Thursday at 2 p.m., we'll be discussing the power of plastic rehab. So subscribe to our newsletter today to receive your special invitation. Thank you all for joining us today, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.